At 4 a.m. local time, 7 FP-1 UAVs left a secret launch site in Kherson, dropped to an altitude of about 50 feet, and headed toward the Syvash railway bridge nearly 130 miles to the southeast. What the Ukrainians did not know was that the Russians had already predicted the corridor they would be forced to use. About 35 miles east of the bridge, a Russian operator monitored the Moskva 1 electronic reconnaissance system. Only a few weak signals appeared on the screen, but all of them were coming from the northwest and converging on Syvash. Behind the lead group, the remaining 10 FP-1s descended to 40-60 feet and split into two groups. The 7 aircraft in front maintained clearer signals to draw attention, while the 10 behind reduced their emissions and hugged the terrain. Flying low made them harder for the Nebo-M radar, positioned about 25 miles from the corridor, to detect amid reflections from the ground and water. But that also limited their flight path. Syvash is a maze of salt lakes, mudflats, and narrow strips of land. Only a few corridors were suitable for approaching the bridge. Ukraine knew that, and so did Russia. The 17 FP-1s were flying straight into an ambush corridor that had been prepared in advance. Data from Moskva 1 was transmitted to a command vehicle on the eastern shore of Syvash, a nearby pole. 2-1 system was ready to begin jamming, but the Russian commander ordered it to remain silent. If the signal was cut too early, the FP-1s could switch to autonomous mode and Ukraine would know the corridor had been detected. Russia did not want to block the signal. They wanted to trace it back to its source. In addition to the 17 FP-1 UAVs, a PD-2 was flying at high altitude over Ukrainian-controlled territory, acting as an airborne relay between the control team in Kherson and the low-flying UAV formation. It transmitted only short commands such as changing direction, lowering altitude, or switching targets. But every time the PD-2 transmitted Moskva, 1 gained another clue. 2 reconnaissance stations along Syvash measured the direction of each transmission burst. After several orbits, the bearing lines began to intersect. Russia identified the PD-2 and realized that its signal extended farther to the northwest. Meanwhile, at the end of the corridor, 2 Buk M3 systems and several Shilka M4s remained silent. The Russians had already seen the formation approaching, but they were waiting for it to move deeper into the kill zone. They did not want to fire yet, it was not time. Meanwhile, every data packet passing through the PD-2 gave Moskva 1 another bearing line. Traffic through the PD-2 increased sharply. On Moskva 1, the communications chain now became clear. FP-1 PD-2 Ukrainian control team. After repeated transmissions, Moskva 1 could see only one active communications link, and the Russians had reason to believe it was the only one. Moskva 1 narrowed the source down to an area to the northwest. Russia still did not know the exact location of the bunker, but they now knew where to look. Near the Syvash bridge, the FP-1s were only about 8 miles from the target. Ukraine was closing in on the bridge, but behind them, another hunt had just begun. The Ukrainian operators knew that every command transmitted through the PD-2 left a trace, so they kept each data burst under 1 second and continued pushing the FP-1 formation deeper into the corridor. At an altitude of about 50 feet, the UAVs skimmed above the water at nearly 100 miles per hour, but mudflats and salt lakes bordered both sides. The formation was now compressed into a corridor less than 8 miles wide. What the Ukrainians did not know was that the Russians were not trying to stop them from entering, they wanted to keep them trapped inside. The lead FP-1 had just crossed the raised causeway when the radar of a Buk M3 system suddenly came online. Seconds later, a surface-to-air missile raced toward it from only a few miles away. The FP-1 immediately pulled up and turned sharply to the left. The missile detonated behind it, shaking the UAV violently, but it kept flying. The control team believed they had just escaped the first defensive layer, but the Buk M3 did not necessarily need to hit the FP-1, it only needed to force it to climb. Remember that climb. At 50 feet, the UAV was still mixed into reflections from the water, fog, and terrain. But once it climbed several hundred feet, its shape and heat signature immediately became much easier to track. From the eastern side of the corridor, a Shilka M4 rotated its 23mm gun mount and opened fire. A burst of rounds swept across the flight path, tearing into the wing and control surfaces. The FP-1 rolled sharply and crashed into the mudflats. The second UAV immediately turned west, but on the opposite side, another Shilka M4 was already waiting. Seconds later, the second FP-1 was also struck by 23mm fire. That was the entire design of the ambush. The terrain forced the UAVs into the corridor. The Buk M3 forced them to maneuver or climb, and the two Shilka M4S on either side waited for targets that had just emerged from cover. Ukraine had avoided the first missile, but that was not the moment they escaped the trap. That was the moment the trap truly closed. The two Buk M3 systems, worth a combined $80 to $100 million, were positioned around the Syvash corridor and doing exactly what they were supposed to do, forcing the FP-1S out of the cover provided by the terrain below. But at that moment, a weakness appeared. To track targets and guide missiles toward them, the Buk M3 radar network had to transmit. When the radar came online, it could see the UAVs more clearly, but it also revealed its own position. It was like turning on a flashlight in a dark room. You could see whoever was approaching, but everyone outside could also see exactly where you were standing. The FP-1s continued racing through the corridor between the salt lakes and mudflats. Buk M3 missiles repeatedly forced them to change direction or climb, while two Shilka M4S on opposite sides of the corridor waited for targets that had just emerged from cover. On the Russian screens, UAV symbols began disappearing one by one. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. At the same time, Moskva 1 quietly continued recording every data packet passing through the PD-2. Russia still did not have the exact coordinates of the Ukrainian control team, but the search area was steadily shrinking. Russia wanted to destroy both the UAVs and the people controlling them. But the FP-1s that had just been shot down were only decoys. One deliberately climbed, forcing the eastern Buk M3 position to keep its radar active. Another moved toward the opposite flank, forcing the second radar source to come online as well. But throughout all of this, two FP-2S had been circling outside the corridor. They were not targeting the bridge. They were waiting for two targets that had not yet appeared, the Buk M3 radars. Once both emitters were confirmed, their coordinates were immediately transmitted through the PD-2. Russia had just trapped the Ukrainian UAVs, but at the same time it had also just switched on a beacon for the two FP-2S. Back in the Syvash corridor, the remaining FP-1s dropped back down to about 50 feet and continued racing toward the bridge. Behind them, the two Buk M3 radar positions had just been disabled. Ukraine had broken through the first layer of the ambush. But about 12 miles away, the Russians were now focusing on a different target. After 20 minutes, Moskva 1 and the reconnaissance stations had recorded every short data burst transmitted through the PD-2. Each time Ukraine sent a command to change direction or lower altitude, Russia gained another bearing line. The signal lines began to overlap. A search area several miles wide gradually narrowed down to a specific location. A soldier stepped outside and heard the sound of a small engine circling repeatedly overhead. Beneath the clouds, an Orlan 1-0 was orbiting their position. The Ukrainian team immediately understood what that meant. The UAV was not there to attack. It was keeping the bunker in view for another weapon that was already on its way. They had only a few seconds to blind that eye. Ukraine had just escaped the trap at Syvash, but Russia was closing a second trap this time around the people controlling the UAVs. Just 3 seconds after spotting the Orlan 1-0 circling above the control bunker, Ukraine launched an FPV interceptor. Its only mission was to ram the reconnaissance UAV before the Lancet. 3 could be guided more precisely. The first FPV climbed sharply through the mist but missed the target and crashed into the mudflats. The second approached from a lower angle, cutting ahead of the Orlan 1-0's circular flight path. The distance dropped to 300 feet, then 150 feet. The two UAVs collided. The FPV shattered while the Orlan 1-0 lost part of a wing and crashed into the reeds. Russia had just lost its eye in the sky. But before it went down, the Orlan 1-0 had confirmed the locations of the generator, antenna, command vehicle, and bunker entrance. The final coordinates had already been passed to the Lancet 3. Russia no longer had real-time imagery, but the Lancet still knew the area it needed to search. Meanwhile, the remaining FP-1s were only about 5 miles from the Syvash bridge. Thick fog and a crosswind of nearly 20 miles per hour began pushing the formation off its approach line. The Ukrainian team was forced to keep sending commands through the PD-2. Adjust left. Drop lower. Reduce speed. Each data burst lasted less than a second, but Moskva 1 could still detect them. The same transmissions keeping the FP-1s on course were also confirming that the control team was still at the same location. The bridge was now 4 miles away. One FP-1 drifted to the right. A correction command was sent. Now 3 miles. The camera began to make out the railway tracks and the first section of the bridge span. One final command to lower altitude was transmitted through the PD-2. Then a Ukrainian soldier looked up. Beneath the low clouds, a small black dot appeared from the southeast. It was not circling like the Orlan 1-0. It was coming straight in. The Lancet 3 had arrived, and the FP-1s were still about 3 miles from the Syvash bridge. The Ukrainian team now had to complete the attack before the Russian strike reached their own bunker. The Ukrainian team had prepared Team B at a backup position about 26 miles from Team A. For nearly half an hour, Team A maintained the link through the first PD-2, while the second PD-2 remained silent and waited for the order to take over. When the FP-1s were about 2.5 miles from the bridge, Team B activated the second link and took control. Team A immediately shut down its equipment, left the bunker, and left behind a decoy transmitter. Less than a minute later, the Lancet 3 dived onto the old coordinates, destroying the generator and bunker entrance. Russia believed the control team had been eliminated, but the bunker was empty. Meanwhile, Team B continued guiding the FP-1s toward the bridge. Moskva 1 detected the new transmitter, but by the time Russia began locating it, the lead UAV was only about 1.2 miles from the target. 3 UAVs were separated from the formation. The first struck the middle of the span, the second hit the joint between 2 spans, and the third struck the southern support area. 3 UAVs, 3 load-bearing points. The bridge did not collapse completely, but the railway had to be closed for inspection and repairs. A Russian logistics train about 6 miles away was forced to make an emergency stop before reaching the bridge. Russia had identified the correct bunker, and the Lancet had struck the correct coordinates, but they were too late. By the time Team A was attacked, Team B had already taken over. By the time Moskva 1 detected the new signal source, the FP-1s were already right in front of the target. The Russian ambush found the control team, but only after the mission had already been handed over to someone else. What do you think truly decided the outcome of this mission? The backup control team, the second PD-2, or the timing of Ukraine's transfer of control? Leave your thoughts below. And if you want to keep following technological battles like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for the next video.